Hi everyone, thanks so much for checking out my channel, and thanks especially for checking out this video. This video is a long one, but it's full of a lot of facts and crammed with a lot of dense research that I've done personally. When I started my personal journey of theological inquiry, starting out as an atheist and gradually becoming more agnostic, I got interested in the question of which religion is the most evidence-based. And to answer that question, I decided to look to my own background as a professor and a journal editor. So I developed criteria that were objective and academically rooted. And believe it or not, we actually can answer this question: which religion is backed by the most evidence? And this video is the culmination of my journey asking and answering evidence-based questions about each of the world's religions. And over the next half hour, I'm going to make a systematic case that Christianity is the tradition with the strongest evidential profile of any major world religion. First, just so you know my perspective, my starting point is definitely calibrated in certainty and epistemic humility. However, I think that puts me in a good position to make these arguments. They're informed by my background as a professor and also as an editor of two separate scholarly journals in my field. And specifically, the question I'm asking in this video is what someone with no prior denominational commitment would conclude looking at patterns of evidence academically and across all the major theological traditions of the world. All right, so welcome to the culmination of months of research that I've put together as the Comparative Theological Framework, or CTF Argument. All right, the CTF has four defining features. It's comparative. The same criteria gets applied to every tradition. It's quantitative. Wherever possible, I'm using measurable data, not vibes. It's convergent, so no single argument carries the case alone, and the case works through the cumulative weight of 13 different independent lines of evidence. And it's a ranking argument, not a truth claim. Given theism, which tradition has the strongest evidential profile from a neutral starting point? Now, the evaluative standard that I use throughout is what I call the rational theistic gambler. So imagine that there's someone who believes that God exists, but has no prior religious commitment, so no subjective preferences. And that individual is trying to pick from among the major world religions on evidence alone. Which tradition would they choose and why? That thought experiment is also a constraint for my own reasoning. If you had no subjective preferences and you were just a dispassionate decision maker with no pressure from family, culture, or community, which criteria would you use to weigh the religions of the world? And probably some of the factors that you look at would be early attestation, multiple independent witnesses, historical grounding, falsifiable claims, cross-cultural recognition, intellectual legacy, and archaeological verifiability. Many of these are tools that academic historians already use for evaluating ancient sources. So in many cases, this framework applies historical academic standards to comparatively weigh theologies. So I came up with 13 criteria or considerations, and they're organized into two categories. Empirical arguments look at patterns of evidence that can be compared across religions directly, so things like witness count, transmission speed, verification rates. And qualitative arguments examine features more specific to early Christianity. So these are important considerations, but they're factors where clean, cross-traditional comparison just isn't possible. And on this slide are the 6 empirical arguments that I'll present: cross-traditional veneration, witness density, Creedal and Codicological speed, attestation lag, archaeological verification, and intellectual legacy. And the 7 qualitative arguments are attestation congruency with secular events. I know that's a mouthful, but we'll talk about it more later. Hostile source attestation, Jesus as a healer, the itinerant teacher tradition, historical intent, impact on Second Temple liturgical change, and the presence of initially antagonistic martyrs in the formation of Christianity. Now, before I present the data, what would atheism predict? Now, if no religion is true, and these are independent variables, we'd expect a roughly symmetric distribution of evidential quality across religions. Whatever patterns show up for one tradition forming in one region should be roughly duplicated elsewhere. No clear winner, and interestingly, spoiler alert, this prediction is definitely not what we see. And as we present these arguments, you'll quickly see something else that naturally follows from the data, and it's worth noting, although we'll underscore it again. You can't disqualify Christian historical claims on evidentiary grounds without also disqualifying large portions of accepted ancient history. Any criteria that rules out early Christian sources, things like attestation lag, theological motivation, or source proximity, simultaneously rules out events that we do accept as historical, often attested by the very same sources skeptics cite against Christianity. So the argument isn't that Christianity is therefore true. It's that the evidential profile of early Christianity is on par with the standards that we already apply. Structurally, the 13 categories function both individually and cumulatively. So they're sort of like events in a decathlon. You can push back on any single argument, but to actually move the needle, you have to push back on most of them, because each one on its own is a point that merits its own consideration. Alright, so here's the TLDR essentially of the entire talk. Among ancient religions, Christianity has the strongest evidential profile, and really no other ancient tradition even comes close in any category. When you include religions founded in the last 2 centuries, Christianity still finishes on top overall, and that was really stunning to me. And that outcome creates a problem for other theologies, but it also creates a challenge for atheism, because atheism wouldn't predict one religion to be a pronounced outlier. Alright, so here's the bottom line in one sentence. Among existing major world religions, Christianity is the starting point with the highest epistemic confidence. If I had to bet on any one religion being true, Christianity has to lead based on clear data. Let's say that you're in a library and you can check out only one religious text. The Bible would have to be the one that you would start with if you want to start from the clearest, cleanest starting point. That's not my opinion. It's the conclusion that emerges from very clear data. Now, before we go into the arguments, if you get something out of this video, please click the like button. That means so much to our channel. Please subscribe. Please click the bell icon for notifications so that you don't miss out on future videos. And please comment. I'd love to keep this conversation going in the chat section. Your support really does help out our channel in so many ways, and I really appreciate all of you. All right, so here are the empirical arguments. The first argument is that Jesus is uniquely, widely venerated across competing traditions. So no other religious founder receives authoritative recognition from competing traditions the way that Jesus does. And I'm looking at authoritative figures, not fringe sects. Here's the justification for this data point. If multiple religions that disagree with each other on almost everything converge on treating one figure as authoritative, that convergence becomes an important data point. Think of it this way. If you're a theist, but you're otherwise uncommitted and every other religion tells you that you have to adopt a certain practice or a moral standard, you would treat that recommendation as having higher epistemic confidence, particularly if those religions agree on this point, and particularly also if they don't agree on anything else. Our rational theistic gambler would probably look to areas of consensus and hone in on those areas. Now, we'll address some of the potential counter-arguments in later slides, but that's the starting claim. But let's highlight a few prototypical examples. Let's begin with Hinduism, which predates Christianity by more than 1,000 years. Swami Vivekananda, who brought yoga to the West, said that he would have washed the feet of Jesus not with anointing oils, but with his own heart's blood. And he considered Jesus to be a yogi or an avatar. Gandhi, also a Hindu, described the Sermon on the Mount as the most powerful moral teaching he had encountered, and he put it on par with the Bhagavad Gita, and he actually shaped his entire philosophy of nonviolent resistance around it. Let's briefly look at some other figures. The Dalai Lama, in his own book, calls Jesus a fully enlightened being. Pinchas Lapide, an Orthodox Jewish scholar who never converted to Christianity, published a book in 1983 arguing the bodily resurrection of Jesus was a real historical event on historical and critical grounds. Islam, of course, also treats Jesus as a canonical prophet, born of a virgin and a performer of miracles, who will return at the end of days. He's named actually 25 times in the Quran, which is more than almost any other figure other than Moses. The list goes on, by the way. Thich Nhat Hanh, one of the world's greatest Buddhist scholars, called Jesus his own spiritual mentor. The Baha'u'llah called Jesus the Son of Man, and there are really dozens of other examples. Now, Judaism is a special interesting case. The largest mass exodus of Jews from Judaism in the ancient world was towards proto-Christianity. Devout Jews like James, Peter, and Paul converted to a movement centered on Jesus. No other religious movement has really ever resulted in such a strong shift, and there were numerous kings and leaders who tried to engender conversions of Jews who were unsuccessful. Baha'i recognizes Jesus as a manifestation of God, and Jain scholars have recognized him as a figure of ahimsa comparable to the Jain ideal. So here's what the rational theistic gambler would conclude. If a figure is treated as authoritative by traditions that disagree on almost everything, the most parsimonious explanation is that something about that figure is genuinely extraordinary. Let's put this another way. Almost every religion points towards Jesus, but Jesus points only toward himself. Now here's the quantified version, and I ran this evidentiary analysis in 2 ways. Here's the strict criterion, which is recognition as inherently divine, an avatar, an incarnation, or a manifestation of God. So Jesus scores 6, which is the highest score by this criterion. Now here's the broader criterion, which is recognition as a prophet, messiah, or divine agent. Jesus again scores the highest, he scores 7. The next highest is Moses, who scores 3. So we can run this analysis in different ways, and no matter how we do it, Jesus winds up being an outlier. Now, there are some slides here that I'm just going to gloss over, but even our analysis might be an underrepresentation based on some anecdotal observation, but I did try to be even across traditions. But Messianic Judaism, for example, may belong in its own category and may comprise, by the way, up to several 100,000 individuals. That's just one example. I'll leave the slide on the screen for a moment, and you can freeze frame if you'd like to read it in greater detail. All right, so let's bring our paradigm back in. The rational theistic gambler would look for consensus between traditions. Here, we have an unusually high consensus around one individual. And to underscore this point, this is something that atheism also would not predict. So our second empirical argument is how many witnesses there were affirming each theological tradition, and we'll look at specific time intervals, including the first 50, the first 100, the first 150, and the first 200 years after the origin of each theology. And again, I applied two counting standards across 13 traditions, including strict and loose standards. By the strict definition, only figures with multiple preserved discourses, authored letters, or extended speeches in canonical texts are included. That's the highest evidentiary bar, comparable to what historians would demand of any ancient figure. But by the loose criteria, I included any named figure with at least some attributed speech preserved in canonical sources. So what you're looking at here is the counts at each interval. Christianity leads or ties at almost every point on both standards. And again, this is surprising. Even with modern religions included, Christianity still ranks very highly, second to LDS on strict criteria and tied with Buddhism. But if you employ the loose criteria, then Christianity is at the top of the list. That's not at all what I would have expected, particularly from an ancient religion. And this is an aside, but I really wanted to include non-canonical material for Christianity, especially the itinerant teacher tradition. But there was really no methodologically uniform way to apply a more inclusive criteria across other traditions. But again, we'll come back to this point later. Now, there were two traditions that had to be excluded entirely. Shintoism doesn't have an identifiable individual founder nor clearly attributable teachings. Mandaism and Druze are very clandestine and esoteric traditions with deliberately restricted transmissions, so their early witness counts would have been low for reasons that are really more related to secrecy. But how would our rational theistic decision maker look at these criteria? Historical scholarship emphasizes multiple witness attestation as a marker of reliability. We're not claiming theology is true, but we can use academic historical criteria to rank order each of these traditions. On witness density, Christianity leads among ancient religions and leads or ties among all religions. Again, I was not expecting this result when I started to do this analysis, so this was genuinely surprising to me. All right, the next argument is how fast did each tradition commit its founding miracle claims into a written or verbal form? If this is a faster process, then our rational theistic decision maker would likely perceive that tradition with higher confidence. If this process takes centuries, then there's more time for memory distortion and obfuscation. So we'll look at two different metrics. The first is Creedal speed, which is years from the founding event to the earliest fixed confessional formula, attesting the core miracle or revelation claim in each religion. In Christianity, that's 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3 through 8. Even very skeptical scholars think that this happened within 2 years, but I'll stretch it out to 5 years to be a little more liberal. The second metric is codicological speed. Codicological means referring to a codex. So this is the number of years from the founding event to the first written canonical text. And this metric can be applied universally because every tradition eventually produces a written text. All right, on Creedal speed, Christianity clocks in at 5 years, but the four faster traditions are all post-1820 CE. Now, some religions don't have creeds, and in this analysis, 9 other traditions don't have a founding creed tied to miracle claims at all. But from what we can look at, Christianity seems quite rapid, particularly for an ancient religion. On codicological speed, Paul wrote the first canonical texts around 20 years out. Confucianism takes 130 years, Buddhism takes 450 years, and Hinduism takes around 2.5 millennia. Islam's Quran, on the other hand, is very rapid at 2 years, but that's actually a part of the theological narrative of Islam, so it's hard to disarticulate the theology of Islam and the founding of the religion from the Quranic authorship. Now again, I'm not going to dwell on all of these slides that have a lot of text just for purposes of brevity, but I wanted to underscore that, again, we're employing academic standards, and in textual criticism, speed of transmission does matter, and temporal proximity is a surrogate for reliability. On Creedal speed, Christianity ranks second overall, although that metric is less universally applicable, and on codicological speed, Christianity ranks fifth, but it's first among ancient religions. Again, this was surprising to me. Now, we aren't accounting for changes in literacy as we move forward in time, but we will be able to take that into account in some of the later criteria. And this does justify a higher epistemological confidence in the testimonies. Now we'll look at attestation lags. Now, there's a lot of quantifiable data here. For each religion, I selected 3 representative founding miracle traditions. And for each miracle tradition, I evaluated the first 3 known written attestations. The metric is the number of years between the alleged event and the written attestation. And obviously, a lower number is better. A tradition that commits its miracle claims to writing within years of the events has stronger temporal proximity than one that waits centuries. Now, I ran this analysis several independent ways using scatter plots, regression, confidence bands, origin year analysis, and all the iterations converged on the results. Now, I'm going to skip over some of these slides, but I'll leave them on the screen so you can freeze frame. But this is our best fit curve, and these dots, which are very close together, represent the attestations for the theological events at the origin of Christianity. Now, for purposes of this graph, I actually parsed out the Torah from the New Testament, but as you see, the data points that are here from Christianity come fairly early. By the way, Christianity here is actually represented by 3 different data points, but they look like one because they're so close together. So here are the absolute rankings, which is not the z-score data, but this is already interesting, and by attestation lag alone, Christianity ranks higher than any other ancient religion. Now, these are attestation lags on the left, and the gaps between attestations on the right. Now, I'm just going to leave this word slide up, but the most important thing here is the ranking. But let's look at the data in a slightly different way. The raw attestation lag rankings I just showed reward modern religions for being born into the print era. So a more nuanced question is, given when a tradition was founded, how much faster did it attest its miracle claims than what we'd expect for its era? Now, I'm going to gloss over the statistical analysis, but the information is here on the screen. Now, here's what the data looks like when you focus more on the deviation from the best fit curve. So this is a way of controlling for the fact that more modern religions had access to much more advanced printing modalities. In raw numbers, Christianity's actual average attestation lag is 46 years. The curve predicts 270 years for a tradition founded around 30 CE. That's roughly 5.9 times faster than what's predicted. Judaism in gold also sits below the curve, but Christianity is the most extreme negative outlier in the dataset. And here's the full ranking across all 17 traditions shown as standardized residuals from the curve. Negative values on the left mean a tradition attested faster than the curve predicted, and Christianity at the bottom has the largest negative residual at t equals negative 1.99. And critically, this result is stable across every curve adjustment specification I tested, including log linear, age log, and leave one out regression. So the ranking doesn't depend on the methodological choice. Now again, I emphasize that this was a very stunning result. I was not expecting this. And just to emphasize robustness, you can run these analyses in many different ways. Different regression specifications, different robustness checks, different ways of handling outliers, but Christianity consistently comes out on top in terms of outlier status relative to what the curve predicts. This isn't a quirk of one specific methodology. It's a robust finding, and I did the analysis in several different ways. And as I'm scrolling through these other graphs, you can run these numbers several ways and you get largely similar results. Among ancient religions, Christianity has the most witnesses to theological claims and the shortest gaps between claims and attestations. The miracle claims of Christianity are repeated the most quickly and the most robustly of any ancient tradition. And by several measures, when we consider the age of Christianity, it's in a shorter time frame relative to our best fit curve and compared to every other religion, including modern religions. Now, our rational theistic gambler would be forced to conclude that there are early and rapidly repeated attestations compared to every other theology. Now, here's the 5th empirical argument. Named individuals and locations extracted from 15 canonical texts across 15 traditions. And here we assessed for independent verification through archaeology, epigraphy, numismatics, or external historical sources. Now, for the Bible, we actually have an academic source, which is Lawrence McKittick's peer-reviewed work in Biblical Archaeology Review. That's the only systematic peer-reviewed verification study of its kind that I've been able to find for any religious text in the world. For every other tradition, I assessed against available secondary scholarship and my own research. The absence of comparable peer-reviewed studies for other traditions is itself sort of an interesting finding, and I think it implies scholars have invested in verifying the Bible's claims because the Bible's claims are specific enough to test in the first place. Now, in the interest of time, I won't name all the texts, but here's the list of canonical works that I reviewed. This was very time-consuming, so please like the video if you're getting something out of this. This really took a lot of work. Now again, for purposes of this analysis, I did keep the Old Testament and the New Testament separate, but even keeping each resource separate, the data is really striking. And we're looking at verified individuals first, starting with absolute numbers, and then percentages, and then we're looking at verified places. Again, the Bible is clearly an outlier in how much of these details are historically verified. Now, there are several cases where a canonical source has higher percentages of verified figures or places. However, those sources all seem to have far fewer data points and also are more modern. That's an interesting observation in and of itself. Now, I'm going to leave this slide on the screen so you can freeze frame, but I thought I'd provide some examples of some of the verifications. In the interest of time, though, I'm not spending too much time on some of these slides, even though I think that they are illuminating. Now, here's the biggest caveat. The absence of peer-reviewed verification studies for other traditions is itself a very interesting finding because testable claims attract scholarly attention. The Bible's claims have attracted scholarly analysis precisely because they're specific enough to falsify. I wish I had time to go into more detail because the Book of Mormon is a really interesting outlier case. It makes several claims that seem to be blatantly anachronistic, and interestingly, the Smithsonian Institute and the National Geographic Society have both issued formal statements that no archaeological evidence supports any of these claims. These other works are also very interesting to get into, but in the interest of time, I sort of have to gloss over some of these interesting points. Maybe I'll make a separate independent video about this. Now, how would our rational theistic gambler process this information? Now, verification of individuals and places isn't the same as verification of theological events, and I won't conflate them, but archaeological verification is still legitimate for comparative purposes. Part of what makes it legitimate is that the New Testament writings predate the era of deliberate theological forgery. Large-scale theological forgeries don't become more common until centuries later, and the multiplicity of New Testament authors makes a coordinated hoax extremely unlikely. There's no ancient parallel for a body of work with this much historical grounding written as fiction. Now, I know that most atheists will balk at the idea of taking this archaeological verification as a surrogate for the validity of theological narratives, but again, the purpose of CTF is to make a comparison across theologies. Now let's look at our last empirical argument, which is quantification of intellectual legacy. So I reviewed 3 original datasets to measure Jesus' influence in secular scholarship. The question is this: if Jesus was a genuinely extraordinary figure, we'd expect his teachings to carry unusual intellectual weight across disciplines that have no theological stake. I built 3 datasets with different methodologies and strict inclusion criteria, and the inclusion criteria are that the figure must use Jesus constructively and directly in their own framework. So mere mentions of Christianity, religion, or biblical themes don't qualify. Polemical, dismissive, or purely sociological references are also excluded. All 3 datasets converge on the same very asymmetric result. So here's dataset 1. It's the ISI Web of Science list of 37 scholars meeting the 500 citation threshold. 8 of 37 use Jesus constructively in their own frameworks. That's 21.6%. For Buddha, it's 0, for Muhammad, 0, Krishna, 0, and I couldn't find any evidence that any other religious figures were cited constructively and directly. Now, I'm not going to list the 8 scholars, but their names are on the screen. Now here's dataset 2. It's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's list of the most cited 285 philosophers born after 1900. And 10 of these use Jesus philosophically in their own frameworks. And again, we're not talking about Christological or apologetical usage. We're talking about thinkers who used Jesus constructively and directly. So that's 3.5%. Again, across the board, we don't encounter any other theological figures showing up in this analysis. So here are 4 different zero-count comparisons. So again, we have a very asymmetric distribution of the data. Now, I won't run through the whole list of scholars, but again, it's on the slide. Here's dataset 3. It's comprised of the top 100 most influential thinkers, and this is a composite from 6 ranking sources, including Hart's The 100, BBC Culture Polls, The Guardian's Greatest Thinkers series, SEP, ISA's Books of the 20th Century, and Time's Most Influential lists. 45 express admiration for Jesus' teaching, 16 for Buddha, 12 for Muhammad, and 3 for Krishna. Now here's what's crucial. Of the 61 figures classified as non-believers or ambiguous on religion, 7 still expressed admiration for Jesus. These include Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, Habermas, Weber, Nussbaum, Orwell, and Camus. These aren't evaluations of intellectual merit, and again, aren't apologetical endorsements. So here's where the rational theistic gambler paradigm plays a role. A theologically significant figure should leave a significant contribution to human intellectual history. This is probably a reasonable prediction from the perspective of our objective source. Jesus is the only figure who remotely fulfills that criterion. All right, so we've reviewed 6 categories of arguments that we can actually consolidate, and because we've been ranking and quantifying the evidence, we can develop an overall score and figure out how each religion is doing in the relay race that we've set up. For this overall score, I used each of the 6 arguments as an evaluative criterion, and I scored them on a semi-quantitative scale. And I did this in a lot of different ways, but the results always came out the same. So what I'll go over is this 3-tiered point system that I came up with. So for each criterion, we divide all of the religions into 3 tiers: top, middle, and lower. And we award 3 points for religions in the top tier, 2 points for religions in the middle tier, and 1 point for being in the lowest tier. So a perfect score of 3 points across 6 criteria would be 18 by definition. And this is just a reminder of the 6 criteria, what we're looking at, and how I abbreviated them so you can read the next graph. So here's the full scoring table across all 13 traditions. Using a system that divides into thirds does tend to compress the data. But again, I did this analysis in several ways, including scoring systems that were more granular, but this seemed to work the best. But by using a more compressive and lossy system, I was mitigating some of the advantages of Christianity where it otherwise would have been an outlier. And here are the full results sorted by total score. The maximum possible score again is 18. And as you can see, Christianity actually scores not just really highly, but with a perfect score. By the way, I did mark the modern traditions with asterisks in this graph. So concluding our empirical arguments, Christianity is the most plausible by any evidentiary measure. Among ancient religions, it ranks first across the board in all 6 categories. And as I've said, atheism would not predict this asymmetry, and it certainly wouldn't predict an ancient religion to rank higher than the modern ones which have structural advantages. So there are a number of very interesting observations that emerge from this quantitative analysis. All right, so we've finished the empirical section. Now we're going to briefly move on to the qualitative arguments. These are considerations that matter to the rational theistic gambler, but can't be cleanly compared across traditions the way the empirical arguments can. These are all the features that are qualitatively distinctive about early Christianity, but can't be quantitatively compared across traditions. Maybe the most important consideration is the timing of Christian attestations with other documented events in the Roman Empire. So I built a control data set of 32 events from 10 CE to 60 CE, and these are all accepted by mainstream historians as real and aren't disputed. And here's the question that I wanted to answer. Do the attestation lags for Christian miracle claims fall within the same statistical range as the accepted secular events? And this is the chart that I made, and I just want to leave it on the screen for a second so you can digest it. Now, on average, Christian sources are slightly slower than the secular average, but they're squarely within the accepted range, so they're not outliers. So if you accept, for example, the writings of Tacitus about Tiberius, you're accepting sources with lags longer than the Gospels. As you can see, the core claims of Christianity are documented in the same time frame as other Roman events. As a result of this, there's no uniform criterion that excludes Christian claims from history without also excluding events we know actually happened. This doesn't prove that Christianity is true, but it does show that you need other decision-making criteria if you want to parse out Christianity as false, but accept the rest of what we know about the ancient world as true. Now, the next argument, Christianity has a uniquely large body of hostile or antagonistic early attestations. And here are just a few of the examples. We have Josephus' Antiquities 18.3.3, written about 93 CE, and this calls Jesus a doer of paradoxical deeds. Now, Josephus was a Jewish historian serving Rome who never converted. Even scholars who were very suspicious of Christian interpolations in other parts of Josephus generally accept that this phrase is authentic. And here's the important point, is Josephus doesn't deny the acts of Jesus. The Babylonian Talmud in Sanhedrin 43a records that Jesus practiced sorcery and led Israel astray. So rather than deny the miracles of Jesus, the Talmud explicitly reframes the source. The question in the Talmud is by what power Jesus performed his deeds, not whether he performed them. And this is really interesting because, again, this is a Jewish canonical source. Celsus, around 178 CE, claims that Jesus learned magic in Egypt. Again, this isn't denial, it's reframing. And also the Toledot Yeshu, which is a later counter-narrative, explains in elaborate detail how Jesus obtained miracle powers, including stealing the divine name of God from the temple. You don't write an elaborate explanation for how someone obtained false miraculous power if no miracles were observed. The debate in antiquity wasn't whether Jesus performed extraordinary acts, it was by what power he performed them. Now, the next argument is that there is an unusually large body of writings from all sides arguing that Jesus was a healer. It's no exaggeration to say that there was no ancient figure who had a comparable claim to being a healer with as much evidence. Again, hostile sources dispute the source of Jesus' healings, but none deny them. And no other figure in antiquity has this pattern. The gospel healing accounts are named, detailed, and falsifiable. And I'll leave the information on the screen again so you can freeze frame while I move on. But we do also have the Quadratus letter, which was addressed directly to Emperor Hadrian, not to any believers. Quadratus made a legal style evidentiary claim to a hostile government invoking living witnesses. That's not the rhetorical move of someone constructing mythology. So we have three independent hostile traditions. We have the Jewish rabbinical teachings, we have the pagan Greek, and we have the Jewish Roman side, each acknowledging that Jesus performed healing acts without disputing the source. That's triple hostile attestation, and that is unique in the ancient world. Now, the standard counterexample is Apollonius of Tyana. There's probably not enough time in this video to go into too much depth on that figure, but his miracle accounts come entirely from Philostratus, writing at least 150 years later. There's no hostile sources who felt compelled to explain his healings. No rabbis banned healing in his name, and there's no hostile engagement at all. Now, here's the 10th argument. In many religious traditions, early advocacy comes from authoritative speakers inside hierarchical institutional structures, but this actually is not the case with Christianity. Consider the early Christian apologists. Justin Martyr was a philosopher who converted and kept writing as an independent intellectual. He was not a bishop, and he had no official relationship with the church. He addressed his first apology directly to Emperor Pius without any sort of institutional sponsorship. And we have other examples like Athenagoras of Athens, who addressed his apology to Marcus Aurelius independently, and again, he had no ecclesiastical position. We also have Aristides, who was a private Athenian citizen, whose apology to Hadrian is one of the earliest surviving Christian works, and he actually had no church rule as well. Again, we have the same pattern for Quadratus. So contrast this with the early advocates of other traditions. Early Islamic advocates operate inside the caliphate structure. Every one of them was either the caliph or was within the caliphate. Early advocates of LDS were also all formal church officers, every single one of them. And early Buddhist monks were institutional members of the Sangha from the start. So here's the pattern. We have unaffiliated teachers roaming the Roman Empire, attesting to Christianity despite consequences. Advocates who had little to gain, and they were from a grassroots, decentralized movement. This is very distinctive to early Christianity. No other religion shows this pattern. Now, here's the 11th argument. Many early Christian writings appear to express an intent of communicating historical, factual detail. There are three techniques that recur. There's openness to verification and falsification, appeal to living witness traditions, and citation of contemporaneous documentation. These appear to be distinctive to early Christian writing when we do a cross-traditional comparison. Now, in the interest of time, I'm glossing over some of these word slides, but here are just a few examples of these trends. Now, I will note on this slide that Luke's prologue explicitly frames his own account as historical research based on eyewitness testimony, and he names out several synchronisms. And again, in the interest of time, I'm skipping over some of the other details, but we also have a lot of examples of counterproductive specificity. All right, so here's the 12th argument. There is a really fascinating cluster of documented impacts on Jewish liturgical life that ensued from the period of the death of Jesus. Now, I've made a whole video about this, so I'm going to be a little brief on some of this analysis, and I would recommend that you check out that video as well. But the Babylonian Talmud in Yoma 39b records 4 anomalies beginning simultaneously in roughly the same period as the death of Jesus and persisting for 40 years until the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. The westernmost temple lamp ceased to stay lit, the crimson thread stopped turning white on Yom Kippur, and the lot of the Lord stopped appearing in the right hand during the goat lottery, the sacrifice lottery performed by the high priest. And also, interestingly, the temple doors began opening of their own accord each night. So what I do want to claim is this. Rabbinical Jewish literature, not Christian sources, record disruptions in Jewish liturgical practice in the period surrounding the death of Jesus. And Josephus also records this. He records this in the Jewish War, 6.293 through 6.296. He records signs and portents at the temple in the lead up to its destruction. Atheism would predict that Jewish theological life would continue unaltered through this period, but it actually didn't. Alongside the liturgical anomalies, we also have the interesting idea that the largest mass exodus of Jews from Judaism in history occurred concurrently with the death of Jesus. Acts reports that several thousand people converted. There's sociological evidence showing a rapid growth in Jerusalem and beyond. And we also have the idea that James' leadership was potent enough to require a severe response from the high priest Ananus II, and that was such a severe response that it actually cost Ananus II his own role as high priest. Now, this entire period was really unprecedented. Over hundreds of years, numerous external forces tried to convert the Jews to other religions and largely failed. We have a succession of leaders who all tried to convert the Jews. But Jews, as a people, were very historically resistant to conversion. The proto-Christian movement succeeded in drawing observant Jews away from Judaism in a way that no other movement did. So something about it was uniquely compelling to a contemporaneous Jewish audience. All right, here's my 13th and final argument, which is the enemy-martyr tradition. It's actually unprecedented that antagonistic features later take on a formative role in the birth of theology. We have Paul, who was formerly Saul of Tarsus, who was an active persecutor of Christians before his conversion. And the critical point here is that he had no grief over the death of Jesus to drive a hallucination. He had no prior devotion to rationalize. There was no social pressure, and everything was actually oriented quite the opposite. So he was an adversary who became an advocate and died for his advocacy. We also have James, the brother of Jesus, who did not believe during the ministry of Jesus, and John chapter 7 verse 5 says this explicitly. And again, I'll skip over some of the details, but they're here on the slide if you want to freeze frame. So here's the important point. The standard naturalistic explanations for the early disciples' experiences, like grief-driven hallucinations, social pressures, or cognitive dissonance, don't apply to Paul or James. All right, so let's move forward to the conclusions. We have the rational theistic gambler paradigm, and this works across 13 independent lines of evidence. Now, the point here is that in the final analysis, among extant major world religions, Christianity is indeed the starting point with the highest epistemic confidence, and I think that's borne out of all of the analysis that we've gone over in this presentation. Well, I know that this has been a rather long video, but I'm so grateful that you've all watched to the very end of the video. If you've made it this far, I would love it if you click like on the video. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. I'm Tavo and Abri. Thanks so much for watching. If this was useful, please consider supporting the channel or sharing this video in whatever social media that you have online. And I know that I've asked a lot from you, and I know that you've already stuck around for a very long video, but I'm really grateful for your attention, and I hope that you all have a really wonderful day.